Today I will come out of another comfort zone. Usually I do presentations and blog a lot about security topics in finance operations, but we already have a great session from Alex Meyer coming up later today. So I thought, well, let's do something different. Also a topic which is really a topic where you should learn things and also take care of during implementations, how to deal with inventory dimensions and probably some setups related to those inventory dimensions, as they can have a lot of impacts in the behavior of the application. As the question, well, I really don't hit anything about the security today. I can't promise, but I will try to just leave it out as much as possible. For your information, I have a slide with some contact details and some experience what I did with the products in the past. If you have any questions now or later on, you can reach me via andre@dynamicspedia.com, but you can also look at my blogs with the same domain, and I have some other social channels at the right side. I'll directly go into the agenda for today. First, I'll give an introduction of what are the inventory dimensions, what's the purpose, and what kind of dimensions do we have available in the application. I will also tell about the data model, how it's all being stored, as it will come back also at the end with the extensibility and some data correction tasks. We'll also tell about some display dimensions where the user can configure what dimensions will be visible for the user or not, and give some tips around that. Then I will talk about some setup options and impact if you enable or disable certain specific attributes of the dimensions. I'll elaborate on some periodic tasks, data correction, some tips and hints on that, and also I will briefly explain that it's also possible to extend the dimensions and add your own dimensions in the application as well. Well, let's get started. The introduction for the inventory dimensions today. What are the inventory dimensions about? What you can do with the inventory dimensions is ensuring that you can define a variance of your products. You can also use inventory dimensions for storing details like a site, the warehouse, or location. But also the inventory dimensions are about traceability. It is possible to also tag all your inventory transactions with a batch number or a serial number. Not only with the item model groups, you can configure what would the costing do, but also you can manage some costing parts on inventory dimensions, where you can say which level of inventory dimensions should be part of your cost price or not. You can also use the inventory dimensions to set certain pricing for sales or the purchase prices, and you can manage some settings for reservations on the inventory dimensions. Well, let's get more into the details about what variance, storing details, and traceability is available in the application. Microsoft divided the inventory dimensions into 3 different groupings. In earlier days, that was until Dynamics AX 2009, it was all called inventory dimensions. And as of AX 2012, Microsoft did make the grouping where they now talk about product-specific dimensions, storage dimensions, and tracking dimensions. For the product dimensions, there's an option for a configuration. The configuration can be managed manually, but there's also an option for product configurations in the system. That part I will not elaborate on. And apart from the configuration, there's also an option to set a size, a color, and a style. And a version dimension has been added about 6 months ago as part of the engineering change management. For the storage dimensions, we have the option to set a site and a warehouse. And for the products, the site and the warehouse is always a minimum mandatory in the application. So you always have to use it. If you're not using it, then probably you can set up some default settings for a site and a warehouse. Next to the warehouse, there's also an option to specify a specific location within the warehouse, an inventory status, which would give you also the opportunity to set an availability status. Is the inventory blocked for delivery or is it available to pick? And there's an option to set license plates, which is introduced also in A2012 as a replacement for the pallet ID as part of the new advanced warehouse management system, which was introduced by Microsoft and got acquired from Blue Horseshoe. For the tracking dimensions, we can set up to enable the batch numbers or serial numbers, and some specific ones are an owner, inventory profile, and the GTD number. The last three belonged to a certain localization in the application, but the owner dimension is now also used by Microsoft, made globally available, as it is also managing the consignment stock on the vendors. Go to the next slide, and I will jump into the application for a brief introduction on those dimension groups, where you can find them and how you can do the setup of the groups. Then we'll start in the product information management menu, where we have the product dimension groups, storage dimension groups, and the tracking dimension groups. For the product dimension groups, we can make all kinds of configurations. We can start, for example, with only a color or a configuration or a size, but you can also make any configuration in the application, like the color and size, or maybe you want to have it in a reversed order, first the size and then the color. I will come back to this option for the order as well, because when this option for a display order of the fields was added in Dynamics 365, and when I looked at the demo database, then I found out that it was just configured in the wrong order, so I will come back to that part later as well. If you want to create a new one or configure an existing, if there are already items linked to a certain product dimension group, then you can't change the settings anymore. Then you have to create a new product dimension group. The same is applicable for the inventory and also for the tracking dimensions. Per setting you create in the application, you can define which of the product dimensions will be activated or not. And if you now look at this demo database, I did not enable the engineering change management here, so the version dimension is not available here, but when you have enabled the engineering change management, that will be visible as well. For the storage dimension groups, it's in fact almost the same setup. There are certain more properties, and I will come back to those properties later as well. But also here you can create your own groups and define which of the storage dimension groups will be enabled or not. And there's one specific option. If you create a new group, I'll make a demo. If you enable the use warehouse management processes and you save it, then it will enable all of the dimensions. As for the advanced warehouse management application, all of them needs to be activated, and when this one is enabled, you can't disable those dimensions anymore because they need to be used for all. And for the tracking dimensions, you can define if you want to use the batch number or the serial number, yes or no. And also the owner dimension, as mentioned, is now globally available. And as part of a certain localization, then you will also get the other two options if that one is enabled in your environment. I promise to come back to the display order of the configurations, and I will go for that to the released products, where I first show, for example, on an item where we have the color and the size. When we look at the variants, in this case the released variants, then the setting was color and size, but now if you look at the column order, we first have the size and then we have the colors instead of the color and the size. So that was a bit odd. When I looked at the application, I thought, well, there's something wrong here. Well, that's not really due to the application, it's more the demo database. So to correct it, I will go to the product dimension groups, and what you can do is manage the order. If we want to correct it to have first the color column and then the size, we can switch the order by just typing the values. And when we now go back to the item and look at the released product variants, you'll see that we now have first the column for the color and then the column for the size. Let me go back to the presentation, as I will elaborate on some more options. First, explain the data model of the application using the inventory dimensions. There are two really important tables in the application. For correction options, I will come back to it, but it's not recommended to make any changes directly in those tables. There's an invent dim table. That table holds all different combinations for inventory dimensions used in the application. If you start an empty environment, there will be one default record already available, which says all blank. That means that there's one record and there's no value in each of the columns. The columns of the table are all the inventory dimensions which are listed on one of the previous slides. So there's a field for the site, there's a field for the warehouse, field for the location, but also the batch number, etc. And when you start using the application, probably you will enter a sales order with a site and a warehouse. It could be site 1 and warehouse 11. At that time, it will create another new record in the application with an inventory dimension, the invent dim ID or a lot ID. It's in fact the same. The lot ID is the display name on forms, and the technical name is invent dim ID. That will then retrieve a number from the number sequence. So it could be the first one, dimension number 1, refers to site number 1 and warehouse number 11. When you then make a change on the sales order line and add, for example, a location and also a batch number, in that case, there will be again a new record created, which will have the combination of the site 1, warehouse 11, a certain location, and a particular batch number. And when you probably the next day create again a new sales order and you enter first site 1 and warehouse 11, in that case it will try to first find an existing record, and only if the record does not exist, then it will create a new invent dim ID record in the application. So if you have a lot of batch numbers and or serial numbers, the table with the inventory dimensions can grow quite significantly in the application. And a second important table is the event sum table, which will have several columns to show the on-hand information per item per inventory dimension in the system. And there are several fields like the posted quantity, maybe financial quantity, reserved, on order. And also over there, it will store everything per inventory dimension ID. And on the on-hand information forms, there will be an aggregation of all the records, probably if you want to view it by warehouse. So for a particular item, you want to see the on-hand information per warehouse. In that case, it will aggregate and accumulate the information based on several records, which might all have another batch number, for example. And as it will aggregate the data source on the on-hand forms is not showing the actual values from the event sum table, but an overridden using some X++ coding. For that reason, sometimes you might also have some issues with customizations if you want to add, for example, an attribute of the event table of the items released products itself. If you want to add, for example, the name field, it will not be presented as at that time it will not have the correct item ID, not the correct information as being displayed on the form due to X++ coding. So you can't use that data source directly to link other tables. Then you have to also add some coding to add certain fields in the application as well. The inventory dimension combinations, that same value which was created in the inventim table, the same IDs can be reused in sales orders, but also inventory transactions, sales quotation lines, etc. So it will not create inventory dimensions per each different area in the application. If you once used an site 1 and warehouse 11, wherever you use it, it will reuse the same inventory dimension in the application. Go to a next slide about the display of dimensions. If you open the application, usually if you go to a sales order first time, you will have fields available for a site and a warehouse on the grids. But there's by default probably the location not enabled, the batch number not enabled. And if you need the batch number, you first have to go to a button for display dimensions, which is now also available on this form just above the item number. That will open a dialog where you can maintain which dimensions will be visible on the grid for the user. So you can enable the location, you can enable the batch number, and you can click on OK. In that case, you will see it temporarily. But if you click on Save Setup before you click on OK, the next time it will reopen the same form, but including the dimensions you selected the previous time. The settings for the display dimensions are stored per form in the application. So if you do it on the sales order lines and you then go to a purchase order, for the purchase order you have to do the same setting again. Another option is defaulting for all of the users, and for that part I have a small questionnaire for you. On various parameter forms, there's a tab page, inventory dimensions, where you have a list of all the inventory dimensions and some settings like order lines, quotation lines, or on another parameter form, you might have a transfer journal, etc. So I have a small questionnaire for you with just one question. If you can scan the QR code or type the link. And it would be really great if you would just provide an answer to this. I will give you about a minute for this. And with your answers, but please be honest, you can change the following part of this presentation. Give you some more seconds. Then 3, 2, 1. Let's look at the results and check what you have provided. I don't see that. Oh, let's go back. You were on this page. Let's update it. We have 35 responses, and the question was, are you aware of the purpose of the inventory dimensions tab page, and are you using it? And now get an answer. Yes, I know the purpose and use it. Yes, I'm aware of the feature, but hardly use it. And no, please explain the purpose. And luckily, there are people who used it and mentioned, no, please explain the purpose. And I would be happy to do that. That will be in my next demo. We go back to the application. First, I will briefly repeat the option where on the sales orders, we will have the option to choose which dimensions will be displayed on the grid. As you can see now, the grid only has the site, the warehouse, and a batch number here. And if you want to have all the dimensions, then you can also go to one of the line details, where also all the information, product dimensions, tracking dimensions, and storage dimensions are available for editing or reviewing. But if you want to have all the information also on the grid, then you can go to the inventory, no, sales order line. I missed it. Where is it now? Display dimensions. I had to scroll a bit. So what we can do here is, for example, enable the configuration, but also the location. And when we do the save setup, you can change the behavior of the grids, and the fields will be visible for editing as well. Now, if you go to the parameters, for example, the accounts receivable parameters, you have seen that currently the site and the warehouse were enabled on the grid for the user, but that's actually being managed via the parameters on the inventory dimensions. If you look at the site and the warehouse fields, they are both enabled for order lines and quotation lines out of the box by this default application. Now, if a new user will enter the system and he did not make any configuration changes to the display of the dimensions, in that case, the system will first look at what dimensions has been enabled for order lines, quotation lines, etc. So if we would like to have the style visible on the order lines for every new user in the application, we can enable this for the order lines, and the same could be, for example, for the serial numbers, where we can enable the order lines, it on the order lines as well. And the batch number, we will disable it now. Once this is saved, then we should have a new user in the system. And let me go to the users page. So we will import a new user. And the user will be Amy Queen. And I apologize, but I had to do something with security in my presentation. So here it is. I have to assign a role to Amy. Otherwise, she will not be able to see any sales order form. So she will be a sales clerk in the application. And if you want to look at the license details within about 1.5 hours, then Alex Meyer will explain more about that part. But now we have a new user in the application, which is Amy. I will open an in private window to be able to log in as Amy in the application. Now, Amy got a training and she's now able to maintain sales orders in the application. When she will go to sales and marketing, go to all sales orders, open one of the orders. Now on the grid, we can have a look what is available, and we see that the dimensions we enabled, the style, the site, the warehouse were already enabled, and also now the serial number has been defaulted for any new user in the application. So it's quite an interesting option to, during the implementation itself, review what dimensions will be used in the application and probably what dimensions should be default enabled on several forms. It would save the user a lot of time to first go to the sales order line, then display dimensions and change it. However, if this user would like to change it now, in that case, the user can decide to take out the style column, for example. So for those who did use it, and there were quite a lot of them, perfect. And for others who were not aware of this feature, you learned something new today, and I hope it will help you in the future with implementations. I'll go to the next part of my application, of my presentation. Some dimension setup options and the impact of enabling or disabling it. On the storage dimension and the tracking dimension groups, there's an option to enable physical inventory, yes or no, and financial inventory, yes or no. On the item model group, you are able to select, do you want to allow for negative inventory, yes or no, or negative financial inventory, yes or no? In fact, for the normal negative inventory, I would recommend to not use it at all. I've seen certain issues in the past when the stock became really negative in the application. It should be corrected already, all those bugs, but still, if you're a trading company, then I really wonder why you would need to have a negative inventory. And I have seen use cases where it was applicable, but if it's possible, just prevent any implementation to have negative inventory. It's not that difficult to just first ensure you have your purchases correctly received and registered before you do the actual sales usually. But there might be exceptions, and I'm aware of such exceptions, but if it's possible, prevent it. For the option to allow negative physical or allow negative financial inventory on the item model group, if you enable the physical inventory or financial inventory on the item model groups, it will also take that dimension into account. So if you want to have the location being part of the physical inventory, for example, in that case, you can't have any negative inventory on the dimension. If it's not enabled, in that case, you might have on the warehouse level itself, not a negative inventory, but in between the locations, there might be at that time a negative inventory. So there would be a choice. What would be allowed in the application or not, and on which dimensions do you want to have a check if you want to have an physical inventory or not, but also the financial inventory. The financial inventory has also an option. If you enable it, it could have a different financial inventory value per location if you have a FIFO or another actual costing model. So the question is, do you want to have a different financial cost price per location, yes or no? It might be beneficial for serial numbers or for batch numbers. I'll come back to that one as well. But having a financial inventory on a location or an owner does not really make sense usually, but again, there might be exceptions for specific implementations. And also the financial dimension, enable it or not, has another impact, and that will be the last option on this slide. As already mentioned, if we want to enable the processes for warehouse management, then we can't choose that much. A lot of information will be defaulted by default. On the storage dimension groups and tracking dimension groups, you can change per dimension if you want to go for the financial inventory to have a cost price per dimension or not. For the product dimension groups, there's no individual setting for that. Apart from, do you want to have a cost price by variant, but that setting is not on the dimension group itself. That's a setting per released product in the application. So if you need to have, for example, a cost price per size of a certain product, shoes, for example, the smaller shoes are cheaper to build and probably also a lower sales price in the store. Compared to a larger size of the product. If you want to enable also the cost price, then you need to go to the released product. For the sales and service purchase prices, you can also enable them on the inventory dimensions, and that option is available also on the product dimension group to be able to have just not a cost price or sales or purchase price by any variant, but only for the dimension size, for example, if you have enabled the color and the sizes. For the consignment inventory, you have to enable the owner dimension. In that case, you can use that feature. I will not show that feature in this application, but you can probably search for some blogs or maybe the Microsoft documentation if you're interested in consignment inventory, how to use it. It's only implemented on the vendor side of the story. You can just find information on the internet for that one. But another option for the implementation choice and the impact of enabling the financial inventory, I will come back now with a real example. If you enable the financial inventory on a certain storage or tracking dimension group, In that case, it will also create accounting entries if you do a transfer in between such an dimension. And I will show the difference in the application itself. And if you have it enabled or disabled, it also have an impact on the inventory value report. For that part, I'll also go back to the application to show you what I really try and intend to tell you here. This is still Amy. We can close the Amy's session and go to my own session. For this purpose, I did create in the product information management 2 different storage dimension groups. One is a default site warehouse, where on the site level the financial inventory is enabled, but site warehouse financial, then also on the warehouse the financial inventory is enabled, where it's not enabled on this one. There's an impact on what will happen in the application if you do certain transfers between warehouses or between sites. Then I created also 2 different items. One is an item number with the site warehouse, and the other one has the storage dimension group of the site warehouse, including the financial dimension enabled for the warehouse itself. Now, if you go to the product site warehouse and its transactions, we have just a few transactions in the system, but enough to explain what will happen. We have the inventory adjustment where we purchased 100 quantity of this product, and this got purchased for site 2 and warehouse 22. Now I did create 2 transfers in the application after the receipt of the goods, and one is a transfer from that same location, from the same warehouse to another site and another warehouse, and one is just for the same site, another warehouse. Now what happens for the first one, when we look at the transaction details, oh, that's the wrong one. When we look at the ledger impact for the financial voucher, of course we have a voucher in the system posted as there was an impact on the inventory and a costing part. Now if we move this item from one warehouse to another within the same site, we go to the ledger, it will not have any voucher transaction, and it will also explain you why. Because there's no financial impact, so there's no voucher available. But we enabled the financial tick box for the site. So if we go from one site to another site, like this transfer, we will have a financial voucher in the application. So during several implementations, I sometimes got the question, I have a voucher transaction for a transfer and I want to get rid of it. In that case, we can consider during the implementation to disable the financial tick box for that specific dimension. Or when they say, I do miss it, we have to enable the financial tick box for a certain dimension to get a voucher transaction. Now, if persons initially complained we have too many vouchers in the application and we want to disable it for the warehouses, for example, that will be a valid request. In that case, it has another impact, but I will tell that in about 5 minutes. Let's go to the other item where we have it including the financial warehouse. we open the transactions, we have exactly the same transactions. We purchased 100, we had a transfer from one site to another site, another warehouse, or another warehouse in the same site. And again, when purchasing the inventory, then we had the voucher transaction. Now, when we move it from one site to another, still just like the previous example, we do have a financial voucher. And for this one, we enabled also the financial inventory. So when we do only a transfer between each warehouse, it will also create a ledger transaction, even though the cost price is the same. Now, about the impact if you disable the financial inventory for a certain dimension. I'll show you the difference also for these two products on the inventory value report. Inventory value reports can be configured in the system, what information to show, in what kind of detail do you want to have the rows, and what kind of information do you want to have in the columns. I can show you the setup in the cost management for the inventory value reports. And in this demo environment, I created a new one, number 50, where I did enable the inventory position, and I want to have the information for each site and for each warehouse. Now, when we configure such a report, we might think we want to have all information about on-hand information and transactions based on the site and the warehouse. But actually, when you have not enabled the financial inventory for one of those two, it will have an impact. I will show you now on the report itself. If we start the inventory value report, ID 50 and all transactions of last year, and I will make it a bit more readable for you, then you can see if we have enabled the financial information for each warehouse, we will also see the information per warehouse. If it's not enabled, then this inventory value report is about all the financial inventory and not the physical inventory. So in that case, you don't have the information on this report. So also here you have an implementation choice to consider. Do I want to enable or do I want to disable the financial tick box on the inventory, the storage, or the tracking dimensions in the application? Let's continue with the presentation. Data corrections. In fact, how to do it, I would say it's not recommended. Stop, don't do it. If you have any issue in the standard application with inventory transactions, please first contact Microsoft support or LCS issue search if there's a known issue and a bug in the environment. And if there's a bug found and you have some incorrect information in the event sum or inventory transactions, the event sum, there's an option to rebuild it with a consistency check. But if you have other information which is incorrect, please contact first Microsoft support to check what can be done or what should be done. Because if you do changes yourself, there's a high risk on having crippled data in the application. And it's not just a warning. I started my career on Axapta, the version 2.5, and I can say I have some information or some experience where I did even cause issues myself. So it's not only just theoretically you can have some crippled data or some database corruption. I have seen it myself. And that's also because we tried to solve some bugs at that time, but we made things even worse. So before you do any data corrections, first contact Microsoft support, and if it's caused by any customization, in that case, you did not do the testing properly enough. That's just easy said, but ensure if you have customizations around inventory transactions, ensure you do real, proper, good testing before you go live. Otherwise, there might be again an issue on some information which might be incorrect. And also on that area, I have some experiences where a certain person created also a customization, and during an implementation, I found out that information was taken in a wrong way, and we had to correct a lot of data, unfortunately, and we could not get any help from Microsoft as it was due to a customization. So if you have customization, test it really properly if it's related to inventory dimensions or the inventory transactions. As mentioned, what is supported? There's an inconsistency check in the organization administration menu available, where you can run a check for inventory, and there's an option to rebuild the on-hand information. In some cases, when you don't have the correct information in the event sum table, there's one option to rebuild it, and that will only rebuild the on-hand information based on all the inventory transactions still available in the application. There are some periodic tasks in the application which you need to consider to enable. And the optimization advisor will also recommend you to enable such cleanup tasks in the application. The first one I want to discuss is the inventory dimensions cleanup. That task will look at all invent dim, so the inventory dimension combinations records, to check if they are used on transactions or not. If they are not used, they will be deleted from the application. And that would just get a bit of performance gain in the application. And in case a certain record will be deleted and next week the same combination will be used in the application, like a certain specific batch number will be used, in that case it will just easily recreate that same combination. So that inventory dimensions cleanup, it's really a harmless job, but it will be for performance benefits to have it periodically running in each customer environment. The same is valid for the cleanup closed on-hand entries. If you look at the on-hand form and you have a lot of serial numbers, for example, if you want to have that form reacting a bit quicker, but also the same is valid for reservations, as it will also show you all combinations for each batch number or serial number in the application, even though there's no inventory anymore. You can use the cleanup closed on-hand entries, which will look at all the invent sum records where there's no quantity available anymore and no cost price, and also tick box that there is indeed no quantity and no cost available. It will delete those records from the application, which will then improve the performance in the application for the on-hand, but also for the reservations. And if you, the same as for the inventory dimensions, if it will be reused in the future again, it will recreate that invent sum record. So there's indeed no issue in using that. And already mentioned on the previous slide, if you see any behavior where the on-hand information is not in line with what you think that the inventory dimensions are posted like, in that case you can run the consistency check to check if there's any discrepancy between the transactions in the invent sum, and there's an option to fix the data directly as well. As last topic for this presentation, about the extensibility, it is possible to add some custom dimensions in the application. So if you are in the need for an additional product or an additional tracking dimension, you can extend the application. For that purpose, Microsoft did create unassigned dimensions in upfront, as there would be a kind of no option to do it without any extensions. Initially, it would require an overlayering, which is not possible anymore. So for that reason, Microsoft created the unassigned dimensions, 10 of a type of string, 1 with a number, and 1 with an UTC date time in the application. It is not supported for the storage dimensions, only for product and tracking dimensions. And I think the storage dimensions are restricted because of the advanced warehouse management features in the application. What would be possible is that you probably create a dimension yourself, or it might be part of an ISV extension. And there might be also a situation where you probably buy 2 ISV extensions where both of them use the same unassigned dimension to extend their own behavior. And as an example, in the past, we had a solution at 2increase called product engineering. That solution got acquired by Microsoft, which is now the engineering change management application. We introduced a version dimension as one of the unassigned dimensions, and there was another vendor who also used that same dimension number. In that case, it can be solved with a conflict handling model, where then on the customer implementation, it will be decided which one, the ISV1 or ISV2, will be renamed to assign another dimension. So it would still be possible to acquire and use multiple ISV solutions, but specific for your own implementation, there might be sometimes a conflict handling required. Now, to know how to do this extensibility and creating your own dimensions, I will not show it in a demo, but there are some links available where Microsoft will explain in their documentation how to do it. And also another example can be read on a blog created by Dick Wenning. He is a former colleague of mine. He also used to be an MVP in the past. He did create also a blog with an example how to create a tracking dimension. So this comes to the end of my presentation, and I wonder if there are any questions in the meeting chat. When I scroll back on another screen, there's one question from Camilo, I see. Would you suggest or think it's a good idea that all inventory dimensions are globally enabled or not? In fact, I would say no, I would not suggest to do it. It really depends on the application or the implementation, but enabling a batch or a serial number when it's not used, or all the variants when you don't have any variants or not a specific style, then in that case I would not enable it. Only enable what you really have to use in the implementation or the customer environment itself. I hope that answers the question. If not, just reach out to me after the meeting. Someone suggested I lost indeed something, but it was due to the resolution. I had to scroll down. Can happen. Also a bit nervous for the presentation again. Then there's another comment or question. Dimension display for on hand is always an issue because that form is called from various places, and each time you call that you have to set up one time and click Save Setup. There's no default parameter to set up the dimension set. Well, in fact, I showed a default option on the parameters, but then again, indeed, preferences for different users. If you have different type of products, one including certain serial numbers or product variants, various people are responsible for different part of your catalog, then indeed it would be really cumbersome to satisfy everyone. And in that case, users have to manage and save the dimension display themselves. That's correct. And someone says, I think that would be via XDS implementation. Actually, I did create an example on XDS for warehouse security. But making columns visible or not, itself, it's not XDS. And maybe, I think it's Hannah, we can have a discussion afterwards what you really intended to say, what would be the XDS implementation part of it, because I'm not fully getting your scenario here. I will try to reach out after the meeting with you. Then another question, is there a consignment inventory functionality available for the customer side? No, unfortunately not. That's not there. You can consider an own customization. You can also have a look at the ideas side if there's already an idea submitted and vote for it, or maybe create an idea yourself if there's no idea yet on the ideas portal. Another comment or question, we have many customizations and processes designed to allow consignment inventory to function in 2012 R3. Very interested in this for Dynamics 365 also. As mentioned, Microsoft implemented on the vendor side, and I think it was already as part of a certain X2012 release, but not sure, fully sure. It has been a while ago. Another comment regarding data corrections. With our partners in the past, data errors would most times take weeks to root cause and resolve. When we have corrupted data, it is impacting getting material to customer. Now, what's advice? The advice is, unfortunately, if you encounter an issue, indeed, it can take a long time to find the culprit. If you have an experienced consultant, he might be a bit knowing the way where to look for. The first time I had to deal with some issues, indeed, we had sometimes even a month required to find the issue. And once we had the issue, we also had to know how to correct the data. And that again can take time, because also those scripts need to be tested in a test environment first before applying it on production. So that's why I recommend initially not do corrections yourself, but first try to see if Microsoft can help out. Maybe if there's a common issue, they might have some scripts available. And if not, indeed, unfortunately, it can take time and maybe could impact also your business. Unfortunately, that's correct. Simon is, I have product variants set up with incorrect configuration codes. What do you suggest? Well, I'm not able to fully understand that question, but I will also reach out to you after the presentation, Simon. Or you can try to send me a message. I will share my contact details again, my email, in the meeting chat later on. And how often do you recommend these periodic tasks should be done? That depends on the number of transactions being created. If you have high volumes with a lot of serial numbers and batch numbers, in the food business, there might be a lot of batch numbers, then maybe run it every week. And if you don't have that high of volume. Once a month might be good enough. And if there's any reason that you think there's some performance issue in between, you can just start it another time in addition. Then from Jan, it's hard. I once add lot dim by date, which effect will on hand logic. That's for semi-public company. There, I think that was just more a comment. And another question, does consistency check fix cost value issues or the quantity issue? In fact, it will not fix any issue on inventory transactions. If there's a mismatch between inventory transactions and the actual invent sum table, it will just rebuild the whole invent sum. And you can also even run it for a particular specific item alone instead of running it for all items. But it will only fix the on-hand information and not anything on transactions. Okay, I will stop my sharing because we're on the top of the hour.